Hello and welcome to the Art Channel. Today Joshua and I are looking at Andy Warhol, a major retrospective at Tate Modern in London. Warhol was born in 1928 and died in 1987. His art charted and led change in an age of huge social and political upheaval. In this exhibition we see him exploring fame and celebrity, consumerism, sexuality, religion and death. And we ask, is he still relevant? Is he still radical?
Warhol began his career as a commercial illustrator, and so he's very familiar with strategies of marketing and advertising. And he begins to embrace this within his own artistic practice. In a painting, for example, like 100 Campbell soup cans, that mimics the experience of going to a supermarket and seeing racks of multiplied products that fascinated him.
These images stress the uniformity and ubiquity of the product. It's packaged, it's everywhere, as you say, everybody can access it, everybody can recognise it, and it is post-war American consumption. He famously said that he used to have the same lunch every day for 20 years. True or not, doesn't really matter, but it's about this accessible, recognisable object, and he's still at this stage using his skill as an advertising artist to produce these images. After Marilyn Monroe's death in 1962, Warhol explores her imagery, explores her iconography and makes multiple images of her. It's extraordinary because she is, I guess, no longer the pin-up of the decade. She's already history, she's already dated, she's already out of date. And Warhol is obsessed with celebrity. I don't think he's critiquing that culture. I think he's consumed and interested in the idea of Hollywood and celebrity.
And he's saying, you want an image of Marilyn when I can give you infinite images of Marilyn. And he's using this sort of humble silkscreen process to mimic the extraordinary marketing machine of Hollywood. But he counterpoints her in multicolour as if she's living on the screen with, on the right, a kind of set of fading images of her that speak of mortality and fading, receding from memory.
In 1966, Warhol announced his withdrawal, his retirement from painting. He wanted to make documentary, to get into television and film, to make sculpture even. And he sort of celebrated this with a big show in New York at Leo Castelli Gallery and made these silver clouds, these amazing kind of cushions that float around. He famously was criticised by Donald Judd, who thought he was a terrible artist. And Warhol decided to kind of exit painting by making three-dimensional floating paintings.
Warhol reacts against the previous generation of abstract expressionists with all of their masculine confidence and competitiveness. But he also rejects that idea of minimalism, all of that kind of intellectual purity characterized by the reduction of the sculptural object to these very sort of simplified forms. Warhol wants to get his hands dirty in terms of popular culture. He wants to observe and comment on, reproduce the world around him of fabulous celebrities, of movie stars, of people he aspired to be, and then of course ironically became himself in the 1970s. But these silver clouds are just fun.
Exploding Plastic Inevitable featured Velvet Underground and Nico. Warhol's films and stills kind of projected over each other. It's very much about performance, strobes, dancing. These shows were amazing. They were quite new, quite challenging, and actually went on tour. And Lou Reed, the singer with the Velvet Underground, described them as a show by and for freaks.
These happenings or performances had a kind of edge of danger to them. I mean, looking back at them, they feel very dated and rather self-indulgent, but there is that air of freedom that the 1960s represented to that generation, that boundaries and restraint and rules could be broken, and there was this unknown new frontier.
We're going to go into college campuses, we're going to tour this, we're going to share it, and we don't actually know what's going to happen. And that's quite exciting.
In 1973, Andy Warhol returns to painting with a series of portraits of Chairman Mao. Now, this is a controversial turn in Warhol's career, because he began to make commissioned portraits for the great and the good. And these have been regarded with a great deal of critical disdain.
He becomes dated. He's lost his veracity, he's lost his relevance in a way. These portraits are interesting because, as you say, they're commissioned. He will make a portrait of pretty much anybody, which you could argue is democratic, but he idealises his sitters, he irons out their creases and their ageing. He is obsessed with glamour, obsessed with celebrity in Hollywood, and he kind of conflates, I think, politics and Hollywood with these kind of jolting images. In 1986, Warhol produces one of his last pieces of work, 60 Last Suppers. It's a huge panoramic piece of work. It's like a giant contact sheet, and it's obviously images of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper made 500 years before this. A copy of this image hung in his mother's kitchen. She was a Catholic, he was brought up a Catholic and claimed to go to Mass regularly as an adult. So there is lots of conjecture about why this image. It's an image of multiple people, which is quite unusual for him, but it's quite an oppressive wraparound image.
I found it really extraordinary, and I think one of the highlights of the exhibition, because it's hung in its own room and it's lit within a dark space. So it's mesmerizing. It's both kind of historic but also contemporary. It's respectful and subversive at the same time.
And it really does bring together all of his fears. He was terrified of death through his whole life.
And of course, it's a premonition too of his death in the following year, 1987, when he dies prematurely following a gallbladder operation.
It's interesting, isn't it? We have all these self-portraits, all these very familiar images of Warhol in his shock wig. They're very recognisable. We know them. They're everywhere. Actually, this is much more of a self-portrait, I think, than any of those images.
Do you think this exhibition teaches us anything new?
I think it's always interesting how an institution curates an exhibition, and I think each generation, each exhibition that comes along can tell us something new because we look at it differently. We look at it with our own interests. Is this man still relevant? I think it's very interesting when we think about social media and the way we communicate and what we put online. Yes, I think he's very relevant in that way, and he's a precursor to all of that.
I mean, there's something quite cold about much of his work. It's quite emotionally disengaged. But therein lies the paradox of Andy Warhol, because actually his pop is about fantasy. His art is about make-believe and performance and aspiration. But there is this extraordinary, brilliant set of observations about the world that was developing around him. And I think ultimately there is something quite oddly sort of inspirational and moving about his work in the sum, namely that he frees us from restriction and inhibition. He allows us to take flight with our fantasies. Thank you for watching and supporting the Art Channel. You can share and distribute these films, and please give us a thumbs up.
We really appreciate your comments and we'd love you to subscribe.